Welcome to the final panel of the 6th Democracy Conference, Populist Nationalism and Euroscepticism, Imagined or Real Threat for Associated Countries. This is the second year that Georgian Institute of Politics is organizing our annual conference online. It took away a coffee break networking opportunity from us, but on the other hand, it allows us to connect with speakers and audience beyond Georgia and to have a truly more international events and international discussions. And I'm happy to see a panel that reflects that, as well as the audience that also reflects civil society representatives, experts, academics, and many others from different fields and also different parts of Europe. Today's panel is special for us for several reasons. So firstly, it brings together Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, the three associated countries, and we can learn a little bit more about democratization challenges in each of these countries, exchange experience, analyze the context, and learn from each other. In addition, Georgian Institute of Politics has worked quite extensively on populism in the last couple of years. And today's panel will link populist nationalism and Euroscepticism. It will discuss its impact on democratization and Europeanization, and we will look at the regional patterns, key populist actors, discourses and narratives in 3 EAP countries, as well as on the role of external, regional and global actors, and the relations between populism and Euroscepticism in Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova. The panel discussion today will be based on a policy paper written, co-authored by today's speakers, which will be presented to you shortly. We will send the publication to all those registered for the conference within the next few days, and also it will be available on our website in English and Georgian languages. I would like to thank our speakers for participating in this panel, joining from different parts of Europe. Thanks to participants for being with us today, and the National Endowment for Democracy for their continuous support that makes this conference possible. And last but not least, thank you, Dr. Stefan Meister, Country Director of the Heinrich Boell Foundation for the South Caucasus, who agreed to moderate today's panel. And I will pass the word to him to start our discussion. So on this screen, you saw the instructions for the language. We have translation in Georgian and English. And you can select the language that you prefer to follow today's discussion. So Dr. Meister, the word is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Renata, and also GIP for inviting me again for this moderation. And I really liked the format. I think it's also a good idea to do the normal conference in several parts, yeah, and to have also the third discussion on a very important topic. Warm welcome also to the speakers and to all the participants from my side. We will have the presentation of 3 analyses on populist nationalism and Euroscepticism in Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, as Renata already announced this. Just a couple of words. Populism and populist nationalism are nothing specific for this region. I think these are global trends as a reaction to globalization, digitalization, growing social and economic crisis, and also linked with a changing world order. Even Euroscepticism is growing in the EU itself, inside of the EU. We see this phenomenon. And at the same time, we are speaking with these 3 Eastern Partnership countries, which are the so-called forerunners, yeah, about states in transition with weak institutions, still weak institutions, Soviet legacy, polarized political discourses, vulnerable civil societies, precarious socioeconomic situation, and a difficult geopolitical and security environment. All this makes these three countries more vulnerable for populism. At the same time, the EU is in a crisis. I think this is also as a reference point. Its transformative power has been weakened. There is no membership perspective and no consensus what comes after association agreements and the DCFTAs. And I think internal vulnerabilities and weaknesses go in line with influencing of external actors like Russia, for instance. So this is not only about disinformation, corruption, but also about conflicts, which keeps these countries busy, and other players meddling also into domestic issues. I don't repeat the main questions. I think you have seen them in the program. We have, I think, here a great panel because these are three people who are doing serious research on this topic. I think this is really a high value. Each of the speakers will have 10 minutes to present their main arguments, and we will have afterwards Q&As. I just want to introduce Anna Medvedeva, who is research fellow at the New Europe Center in Kyiv, one of the leading think tanks in Ukraine. We have Tamta Gelashvili, who is doctoral research fellow at the Department of Political Science at the University of Oslo, working also comprehensively on this topic, and Denis Cenușa, he's researcher at the Institute for Political Science at the Justus-Liebig University in Germany. I just want to ask all the participants during this presentation, you can already ask questions in the Q&A. Yeah, please use this also that we can afterwards read out your questions, and you might later have the opportunity also to ask directly questions. So I would give Anna, like it is here in this order, the first word to speak about Ukraine. Please, the floor is yours.
Dear colleagues, good afternoon. It's my honor and pleasure to be part of the conference and present the findings of my research on national populism on Ukraine. I will try to briefly address the question whether populism in Ukraine represents a major challenge to democratic development and Euro-integration aspirations of this country. I think we can start the presentation. My study focuses mainly on Ukrainian national populism. However, the impact of Russian nationalism on Ukrainian political processes will also be exposed, including its manifestations in annexed Crimea and occupied parts of Donbas. So speaking about key actors, Ukrainian national populists can be grouped into political parties, street movements, and regiments or battalions affiliated with the far right and engaged in the hostilities in Donbas. A visible part of Russian nationalists in Ukraine are those who came to the country around 2014 because of persecutions for their views by Russian authorities and ought to take part in hostilities in eastern Ukraine. While the majority of Russian nationalists came to fight on the side of the self-proclaimed republics, the smaller part, amounting to several hundreds, joined the Ukrainian army. Several political parties in Ukraine contribute to the promotion of Russian nationalism, most notably the oppositional Platform for Life. Next slide, please. The revolution, Russian aggression in Ukraine, and subsequent rise of patriotism led to the popularization of the narratives typical for national populists, including the protection of Ukraine's sovereignty and preservation of national identity, in so much that this topic ceased to be a legacy of ethnic nationalists only. The popularity of these narratives increased predominantly because of dramatic events of 2014 and doesn't generally owe to specific nationalist parties or leaders. Naturally, issues of sovereignty and identity remain significant among national populists as well. As for the other most popular discourses, they are usual suspects like homophobia, targeting Roma people, and the narrative of restoring justice and bringing order to streets, which is typical for countries with flawed rule of law. Next slide, please. Narratives of Russian nationalism that places Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus within one Slavic family united by their close historic and cultural ties to the Russian nation, are found in the statements of pro-Russian parties and media. Representatives of these forces promote a stronger status of Russian language in Ukraine, restoration of relations with Russia, and peace in Donbas at any cost for Ukraine's national interests. They usually seek to undermine the Ukrainian statehood and question Ukraine's ability to live on its own without Russia. Pro-Russian actors actively advance the narrative of Russian propaganda, suggesting that the rights of Russian-speaking Ukrainians are violated. I think we can move to the next slide. Like many Ukrainians in 2014, the majority of national populists in Ukraine choose the European future for the country. However, they prefer to see Ukraine rather as a part of the European civilization than as a potential member of the European Union. Many national populist parties want to form a community of Baltic Black Sea countries in particular. While some Ukrainian national populists recognize security benefits linked to European and Euro-Atlantic integration, they widely oppose to perceived European values, and often by deed, not only by word, especially in street movements. They often disregard such human rights as freedom of speech and peaceful assembly, promote violence as a way to engage with opponents, and systematically attack other people based on identity and beliefs. Some of national populists attempt to establish their own vision of order in Ukrainian streets and restore justice, as they call it, by punishing perceived criminals and enemies without charge or trial. In doing so, they undermine the principles of rule of law, attempt to hijack some functions of the law enforcement, and generally offer populist solutions for complex social and political issues. Some of national populists in particular explain Roma pogroms as help to the police that was not able to react. Representatives of street movements may target prides, equality marches, educational activities organized by LGBT. It is worth mentioning that it is not infrequent that the law enforcement may turn a blind eye to the violence against certain social groups that are often targeted by far-right. For instance, the hate crimes against LGBT, if investigated, are qualified as simply hooliganism. I think the next slide, please. As far as advocates of Russian nationalism in Ukraine are concerned, they are normally not represented by street movements, but usually by political actors, political parties. They try to shed a citizens' confidence in the Ukrainian authorities generally, and their steps on the way to European and Euro-Atlantic integration in particular. Such forces present ongoing reforms under Euro integration and Euro-Atlantic agendas as something that is imposed by the West and doesn't make any positive contribution to the life of Ukrainian citizens. Next slide, please. So indeed, how about impact? Are Ukrainian national populists influential enough to affect Ukraine's democratic aspirations and plan for Euro integration? Ethnic nationalists in Ukraine do not enjoy electoral support, which significantly limits their ability to form harmful policies and pose any serious threat to democratic development of Ukraine and its Euro integration perspectives. National populist parties have not enjoyed a wide electoral support since 2012, when the Freedom Party received around 10% mandates in the Ukrainian parliament. Let me reiterate, 10% of support for a nationalist party was the highest level of support for nationalists in the history of independent Ukraine. And even now, amidst the Russian aggression in Ukraine and rise of patriotism among Ukrainians, the total rating of major parties on the right can hardly reach 3%. National populist actors do not display a considerable success at the local level as well, although some of them have better representations in certain Ukrainian regions. However, the results of local elections in 2020 are around 1 to 2% for different nationalist populist parties. Next slide, please. I think it will be the final one. On the other hand, street movements are in some cases able to make politicians consider their voices, most notably through their participation in protests that gather both the general public and the far-right groups. Such protest actions often target political decisions that may potentially compromise Ukraine's national interests in negotiations with Russia over Donbas. National populist organizations also try to impose their cultural and political agenda on Ukrainian society by attacking certain social groups. The actions of street movements create some obstacles and threats for targeted communities, but cannot fully block their activities, making vulnerable groups seek new ways to conduct their activities and readjust their security strategies. Meanwhile, Ukrainian parties and actors advancing narratives of Russian nationalism are much more successful in terms of electoral support. According to recent surveys, their total rating amounts currently to around 20%, and until recently, these actors had extensively spread messages through their media empire. The oppositional Platform for Life holds the largest number of parliamentary mandates after the majority party, 30%. The national polls demonstrate that the popular trust to the president, Volodymyr Zelensky, and his party has a decreasing tendency, while the level of support for pro-Russian parties, although localized only in several regions, does not significantly deteriorate. The spread of Russian nationalism in annexed Crimea and non-government controlled parts of Donbass blocks any perspectives for the democratic development of these areas and complicates their potential reintegration into Ukraine by drawing them closer to the Russian authoritative regime that cracks down on freedom of expression and belief, peaceful assembly, and disregards the rule of law. Let me conclude by the following summary. As we see, both Ukrainian and Russian national populism may affect democratic development and Euro-integration perspectives of Ukraine. However, we also observe that the nature, goals, the scale, and subsequent implications for democratic progress, as well as electoral support of both phenomena, are very different. Meanwhile, we also recognize that the flawed rule of law and improper investigations, for instance, into hate crimes, into the attacks committed by far-right groups, feature a serious threat to Ukrainian fragile democracy, especially taking into account that its Euro-integration perspectives are dependent on whether the country adheres to the principles of democracy, respects fundamental freedoms, and upholds the rule of law. Thank you very much. I would be very glad to answer your questions if they come.
Thank you. Also, thank you for staying in time to have enough time also for the discussion. Can I just ask you one question? How far Ukrainian nationalist populists share the same values like Russian nationalists? Because if you describe what are their principles, yeah, in terms of homophobia, violence, and so on, I see a lot of similarities. And you have, for instance, in Poland, the current leading nationalists, they are very anti-Russian, but I would say they share the same values often, which are promoted by Russian nationalists. So how would you link this?
Yeah, I think it's sort of logical for nationalists, for populists to adhere to more or less similar framework of values, especially when it comes to LGBT minorities like Roma. One of the reasons is that the narratives of some extreme far-right movements in Ukraine back to the early 2000s were shaped under the influence of Russian nationalists, especially those who were aggressively promoting anti-LGBT agenda. And although this influence has sharply decreased after 2014, this framework still exists in Ukraine. I think it's more typical for eastern regions of Ukraine. However, when we think about west of Ukraine, we also feel the greater influence of the church, which also advances these anti-LGBT narratives.
Okay, thank you. Tamta, please, let's look into Georgia. And I think we need also to change the slides. Yeah, perfect. Please.
Thank you. I will. make my presentation in Georgia as requested by GIP. I hope you hear me all. So when we talk about nationalism, populism in Georgia, so not only in Georgia but beyond it, there are several difficulties related to such talks. The point is that this term is used very often not only by academia but beyond it too, and it can be matching too many things, and therefore it can be saying nothing, in fact. And the second problem is that the far right, they change their ideologies, forms, narratives, etc. And therefore, those who can be considered nationalist populists today, they may be far rights or extremist rights. And in 2020, we had a similar situation when before the parliamentary elections, two parties that we can see and deem nationalist populists today, like the Georgian Idea, Georgian March, they decided to participate in elections, and therefore they tried to soften their previous positions, because before they were against democracy as such as the form of governance, and the Georgian Idea went even farther, and it was in favor of theocracy to be a form of governance in the country, but they backed up on their ideas, and they are not against the democracy as such. They have like specific problems with the liberal democracy and rights of minorities. We can move on to the next slide, and we'll see who are the actors in the Georgian context. So in addition to Georgian Idea and Georgian March, we also have the political party Alliance of Patriots, which is in existence from 2010, if I remember correctly. And another is the FART. Yes, this is the party that has experience of being in the parliament. And as of 2021, like 2 months ago, the new party was formed, the political movement led by Levan Vasadze, and it is called Unity, Essence and Hope. It sounds a little weird and odd in English, but you know, in Georgia, it is an acronym, ERI, which means nation as such, but it is the acronym of these three words. So we will see how it will start participating in the political life and activities. And what unites these groups, and what is their key ideology? Next slide, if possible. Right. So what unites those? And it is natives, it is sort of a narrow form, and its major idea is to have the contradiction between the two groups, like natives, or Georgians, and all who are not natives are foreigners. And among these locals, so to say, and these locals may have different nature in the Georgian context, so usually they mean ethnic Georgians, Orthodox Christian, heterosexuals, so family men and women who are the embodiment of the far right values, the family values as such, and everybody else, they are marked as foreigners, and they can be ethnically, culturally, or religiously foreigners or Georgians, but those who do not belong to that category of natives. As to ideology, they use the ethno-nationalism, and it is close and it's pointed to nativism, but it also includes the belief that nations should be kept separate, so they should exist separately, so that their cultural identity, unique values and features are not lost. And this is what these are ideologies that unite sort of, or is in common for all these nationalist populisms. About a decade ago, the focuses they would make on socioeconomic aspects, one of the ideas that they would support before, and that was in times of economic crisis or transitions, they would say that attention should be paid for protecting the internal labor force from migrants, so that the jobs are not lost to migrants. And then another added, it was socio-cultural aspects, and it became even bigger than socio-economic aspects that they would speak about. And this is how it is today in the Georgian context. Georgian March, Georgian Ideal, or Alliance of Patriots, their narrative does not contain economic aspects, and quantitative research shows that no, it was like 7 to 5% of only narrative, and mainly they talk about socio-cultural aspects. And when they speak about this, things that they don't pay attention to facts, but emotions. So they play on emotions, mainly the fear. For instance, when we talk about migration, and so we don't have the problem of immigration because after 2015, including 2020, the level of migration goes down in Georgia. But when the Georgian March was created, its major focus was made on issues of migration, so to put it on in order, as they said. And it was all about the fear of migration. Similarly, related to LGBT groups and minorities, when their actions, when they act against them, and it's not about their rights or that they have to obtain or obtained already, but it's again, focus made of fear, on fear of LGBT, and the Georgian idea would spread this fear of incest or pedophilia and making it legal, or making legal gay marriages or something of that sort. So it's emotions that they play on, so to say, and mainly fear. And what else the populists talk about? It's the contradiction between pure people and elites, that these people who are natives and who are the most threatened or risked by all these processes, and elites are all these foreigners groups, or those who let the foreigners into the country. And populists, they deem themselves saviors from the corrupt elites, that they have to protect people from those corrupt elites, etc. Now, as to political processes and impacts on that, I will try to summarize to fit the time frames. But in Georgia, just like in Ukraine, these groups are beyond the electoral processes. Only one party has experience of being MPs, and others mainly have these street movements, actions, and their influence is indirect or long-term. And when I say indirect, I mean that when we have cases when far rights, not only populists, would come up with a legislative initiative, would lobby such initiatives, and then submit it to the parliament through two key parties, not only the Alliance of Patriots, but the National Movement and the Georgian Dream, so the ruling party and the key opposition party. Now, despite the fact that they do not have direct access to parliament and other institutions, they can have indirect access and indirectly influencing them, because there's two leading parties. They do not sort of isolate themselves from those parties, and to some extent even share these values. And the last slide, I think. Thank you. Despite the fact that this impact may not be direct and it may not be a short-term but rather long-term influence, etc., the region where Georgia is located has several weaknesses. It makes it more vulnerable before the nationalism, populism. And usually there's three challenges are allocated here, and one of them is weak political party system. So when not ideologies but political leaders have, sort of significance and importance. Another is ethno-nationalism, it's quite a known concept for many post-Soviet countries. And the last and maybe most important is that lack of public trust in public authorities, public institutions, public figures in general. And in Georgia, we basically have very low trust for official public institutions or NGOs or media for that matter. And it makes the situation even more vulnerable in terms of nationalist populist threats. So here I will end my presentation, and if you have questions, I will be happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this presentation. I really want to ask the participants, you can just to remember to ask questions. Yeah, you can really write your questions in the Q&A, which we will then read out after all the presentations. So please ask your questions. Tamta, I have one question, and you already mentioned this point. So these right-wing populist groups, they are not successful in the electoral process. And we saw it in the last parliamentary elections when Alliance of Patriots, I think they had around 3%. So I think it's really relatively low. At the same time, I think they are able to impact the public discourse on certain issues you mentioned. And I think they shift also somehow this discourse to the right. Yeah, so I would like to ask you how far they are successful already. So where do you see their entry points in impacting the public discourse? And have there been successful also in doing so? And why not in the democratic in the elections, but on the discourse level, if it's the case? Yeah. Yeah, I have translation, so I'm fine with it.
The biggest threat that researchers indicate in various countries except Georgia for these groups is that slowly and gradually, not only public opinion, but changes, but other political parties are some sort of forced to take into consideration those ideas so that the whole political spectrum shifts to the right, all of them, the whole political party spectrum, and it becomes sort of, this become more extreme, but normalized as it seems. As to Georgia, I want to say in elections of 2020, the Alliance of Patriots had a very low percent, probably because they split their votes, and votes that they could have received, they were split between the Georgian March and Georgian Idea. So in fact, the votes that right populists did not, that they were spread between these three actors. But it is also evident that in Georgia, unlike other countries, these groups are not really very successful in their endeavors. And the explanation is that these two actors, Georgian March and Georgian Idea, they didn't try to be active in the electoral processes, that they would oppose to the whole democratic processes in general. And therefore, for these different reasons, they didn't want to achieve success in the electoral arena. But for now, these also had shifted a little. As to their influence and success, the issues that they use very frequently, these are LGBT rights, and this is the most acute topic when speaking about these groups. And I'm talking about the mobilization of our rights on the streets around the parliament. And it seems that their key topics are on the LGBT areas or against it. This is where I have the most to say and the most support to gain. As to their level of success, very often as I said, they have no direct impact on political processes, but they do achieve some successes in this regard. And I can recall one event when these groups collected Caucasus signatures of changing the provision in the constitution and explanation of what family is, or marriage rather, that marriage is the union between a man and a woman, and it was not the case before. So although they don't have direct influence, as I said, they indirectly still manage to achieve certain things, and they manage to cooperate and collaborate with some political parties to advance their agendas. And it's not the only case, actually, or where they achieved certain success. So I think that their threat shall be seen in the long-term perspective, and we shouldn't be looking at their influence right now in terms of direct or indirect influence.
Thank you very much. Denis, let's look into Moldova, please.
Thank you, Mr. Meister. I should say that Moldova is a divergent case study compared to Georgia and Ukraine, where you have more prominent far-right movements or parties that are leaning towards far-right discourses and sets of values. Moldova, it's different, and I will try to explain why. Could you please turn the slide, the first slide? So overall, I have 4 slides. I will try to be as brief as possible so that we have more time for questions. So the key actors of the populism in general in Moldova are the political parties, both the parties that are on the left and right sides of the political spectrum. It's important to mention that at the moment we don't have nationalist populists that have a powerful position in the parliament or in any other, let's say, position of power. The last time when we had some nationalists, it was before the elections in 2009. After that, due to moderation and the European integration, the attraction of the nationalists, populists, just faded away. And this is an important trend which we have noticed if we analyze qualitatively the results of the elections in the last decade or so. At the same time, apart from the political parties that, as I told you, are rather populist than nationalist populists, we have also proxy actors that are used quite frequently by the political parties in order to boost some discourses, populist discourses, or to circulate them across the society. And the most important actor, proxy actor, is the church. I refer to the Moldovan Metropolitan Church, which is subordinated to the Moscow Patriarchate, and that's why many times the sources of some populist discourses are coming from Moscow or from Russia, and then they are in a way introduced into the public, the local public, via the church and priests who are serving the Russian church. The other proxy actor is the civil society in general. The organizations are used by those political parties that are promoting populist discourses against elites, the certain elites, and I refer to the corrupt elites that are represented, at least if we read the political discourse of the parties that employ such kind of populism, anti-elitist populism, then this category refers to judges, prosecutors, in general, corrupt politicians. And last but not least, the political parties are also quite effectively factoring and using the power of the mass media, particularly the new media, which is more popular, is getting bigger outreach, and probably is the most efficient way to manipulate the public, to keep the public in echo chambers, and to continuously change their minds or influence their minds in certain moments, like during the elections, or when there are some important decisions to be made by the politicians. As I remember, it was during the adoption of the anti-discrimination law back in 2012. Please, the next slide. The next slide describes the main lenses that help us to understand better what are and where the populists are manifesting their powers. The first area is the identity. As I have mentioned earlier, we don't have nationalist political parties that are powerful or represented in the parliament. But the issue related to the Moldovan identity, which was constructed during the Soviet times, is still an issue, and it is used by some political parties against the debates surrounding the reunification of Moldova with Romania and embracing the Romanian identity, which is a competing identity when it comes to who is, let's say, the largest ethnic groups in Moldova. Still, we don't have a clarity about that. There is a lot of confusion, and the politicians are effectively using that in promoting certain political goals. The values refer mostly to what already was mentioned for Ukraine and Georgia. Homophobia is one of those topics that are massively employed by the populists. But also, apart from that, I think that we have also a lot of conversation about the competing values, which are the values of traditionalist family. We have had similar situation in Moldova where some pro-Russian politicians organized big events that were synchronized with the gay pride parades, and involving also the church goers and the church. So we have a contentious area in this field as well. Ideology is an interesting place where the populists are competing as well. As I mentioned, we have the huge debate about the corrupt elites, and this is part of the discourse used by the newly created political parties after the events in 2014, when Moldova was struck by the scandal about the banking fraud and the other subsequent phases of this huge event that have shaken the political landscape scene in Moldova. So there are political parties which are using populism in order to fight the corrupt elites. And apart from that, they also try to accuse and to scapegoat the civil society that are supporting either the anti-corruption political movements or the European integration political parties and those who are behind them, not only the voters, but also the civil society. And as an additional layer of the ideology place where the populists are omnipresent is also the criticism against the threats that are perceived from the side of the diaspora. Diaspora is in Moldova quite large, and it is presented as through the lenses of us versus them. In times of elections, and we are now ahead the snap elections, there is a huge interest from some political parties, more particularly from the pro-Russian parties, to create this criticism and anger from those who reside in Moldova, from the population that stays in Moldova, against the diaspora that somehow is linked by those populists, is linked or portrayed as an extension of the foreign intervention into the decision-making of the country. So this is an interesting difference, which makes Moldova a separate case study from Ukraine and Georgia. And last but not least, I refer here to pandemic, but actually I rather have in mind the state interventionism. And as Tamta was mentioning, there is a huge distrust from the public against the state institutions, and this was very visible during the pandemic crisis. So those who were in power, regardless of their geopolitical affiliation, they were trying to deviate the responsibility from their mismanagement of the crisis. And this created additional room for anger from the population, obviously filling in the populist discourse as well as the hesitancy against the vaccination, because it was both the anger and disenfranchisement of the population with regard to the officials, and then this had a consequence on the vaccination discourse and campaigning in general. Probably this also has something to do with not very accelerated vaccination rollout in Moldova, which is still higher than in Georgia or Ukraine, but is not as high as in Azerbaijan, for instance, if to compare the Eastern Partnership countries. Please, the next slide. This is the third slide. I will try to be even shorter. So we have, obviously we have an impact on the public agenda from the side of the populists, but it is limited, and it is only efficient in some policy areas like human rights. And here I talked about the homophobia and in general the discourse promoted by the traditionalist political parties. Next, which is also important, populists are overall not efficient. They have a certain degree of presence in the society during the sensitive moments when the discourse is inflamed by the electoral discourses. So this is happening primarily and mostly during the elections. So more elections we have, more frequent they are because of snap elections, more prone society is to become the victim of the populists, be they nationalist or non-nationalist political forces. And last but not least, in Moldova, I have noticed that there is a certain institutional organizational framework created by some institutions, state institutions, which help to mitigate some impact that could be otherwise inflicted by the populist political parties. And when we talk about European integration, I think that obviously the EU and in general the European agenda is one of the victims of the populists. And this is obviously because the society is polarized. There is a visible separation of the population between East and West preferences, geopolitical preferences. Therefore, Moldova is a quite fertile soil for the populists to thrive. At the same time, we have a competition between the political forces, like the pro-Russian ones, that try to create a place for re-Sovietization of some policy, of some areas of public life when it comes to holidays and values against the celebrations of the European integration, which usually takes place around the day of 9 May. During the Q&A session, I could explain you more about that. And please, the last slide. The last slide, please. Yes, and here are some main findings from the case study on Moldova. You'll read in our policy brief, not only for the case of Moldova, but also for the other two countries, that the poverty is one of the drivers of the populists, and therefore one of the attentions of the decision makers in fighting the populists should be in improving the living conditions. Then the political parties, as I already mentioned several times, are the major drivers. So when we look for solutions in this area, we need to pay attention to the legislation on the political parties, their financing, the way they communicate to the public, and so on and so forth. Then also, in case of Moldova, the populism, the national populism is marginal, but at the same time, the other types of populism is ubiquitous, as you could see from my presentation. More than that, populism is also used against some particular decision-making phases. I refer to the adoption of the anti-discrimination legislation, but I think that there are many other areas that should be tackled by us in Ukraine. Could be the discussion about the land and about the land being purchased by the foreigners. In Georgia, it's about the foreigners purchasing the real estate in Georgia and just living in Georgia. And in Moldova, it's about probably diaspora, which is more and more perceived as a foreign actor that is trying to interfere with the local decision-making and the political in general. And last but not least, the European integration remains to be a target of the populists, but I think that European integration helped Moldova to go away from some nationalist populist parties and try to give to people an alternative view about how the country can develop. And I think that promotion of European integration, of the European driven reforms, can further help to cure our countries, not only Moldova, against many types of populism as well as the nationalist one. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have 2 rounds of Q&As. First round is reading out questions, and you still can write questions in the Q&A. And the second round will be just direct questions, so you can raise the blue hand and ask then directly questions in the second round. I just have one question before I open up to the Denis. So national populism is first of all weak because national identity, Moldovan national identity, is also relatively weak developed. So in Moldova, populists focus on other issues somehow, and maybe indirectly also on the classics, but because of this relatively weak identity, it is different. Yeah, so the populism is somehow differently framed. Would it be right, or how would you describe this? I mean, I don't know.
I think that you are defining correctly the situation in Moldova. It's interesting that the confusion about the identity is not giving a leverage to the politicians to use it as a populist tool. So yeah, we have a lot of conversation about which is the real identity, the true identity of the Moldovans, either the Romanian one or the post-Soviet Moldovan one, but they are marginal. So we have an increasing interest, for instance, in the reunification or unification with Romania, which is an increasing, which is spiking, but this is because of other reasons than really the interest to embrace the Romanian identity. So there is obviously a certain share of the population that really finds itself very close to the Romanian civilizational set of values and history, language, identity, but there is a bigger part which is very pragmatic, and they look at the Romanian identity as a way to get into EU and to benefit from the material benefits that the Romanian citizenship is offering, because it's also an European citizenship. I mean, it connects you immediately with the European citizenship. So we have this interesting blend of different interests where the material interest of the population is still weighing in more than the identity in classical sense of this term.
And it's interesting then that the Soviet is used, yeah, because it's either Romanian or it's Soviet, yeah. So it's very interesting, yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Nino, please read out the questions for the first round. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I will read the Georgian questions first, and then I will move to English. The first question is, as I understand it, is for Tamta, about Alliance of Patriots. Did it lose its attraction for Kremlin? And are they not substituted, or will they be substituted by the Levan Basadze's new party? This is one question. Another question is from Tamara Ganeva. It is also for Tamta. In our country, the biggest concern should be social environment and conditions. However, those groups do not articulate those problems, or they do it to a very little extent, as you mentioned too. What do you think can be the reason for that? Why the society is not consolidated around social issues, and why this nationalistic discourse becomes stronger and stronger? And then the author shares that in different discussions she heard that because our state failed to give physical and material safety guarantees in the last 2 decades, then this is then replaced or substituted by the religion and nationalism narrative. So maybe you could share your opinions. And again, this is a question for Tamta.
Yes, I will switch in English now to articulate the English questions. We have 2 English questions. My question is to Miss Medvedeva, but I would also appreciate if others could elaborate on this as well. I was wondering if additionally to Russian civilizational discourse having impact on populist narratives, there is true Europe, in brackets, or good Europe discourse. To frame it differently, can we also speak of pro-Western, anti-Russian populist discourse, especially in the context of Trump's victory in 2016, Brexit, military confrontation with Russia, and etc. And let me ask second question from the same author, Shota Kakabadze. Briefly, what could be practical recommendations that would help with mitigating the impact of populist nationalist discourses on the successful implementation of foreign policy agenda in those countries? Probably all 3 countries are meant here. Yes, please, those are all the questions we have received so far, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I just wanted to add one more question. What role of church? I think Denis has already mentioned it on Moldova, but I think in both other countries, the church is also has an important role. And I would all 3 also ask about this role of the church. Maybe Tamta, we start with you. I think most of the questions were to you, so let's start with you.
Yes, I will speak Georgian again, since I was asked to do so. The very first question is a very interesting one, and probably my answer would be quite speculative, because how attractive would be before Kremlin, and I cannot speak on behalf of Kremlin, as you understand, although as to Alliance of Patriots and Basadze's new movement and the conflict between these 2, I think it would be interesting to observe these groups for another several months, because in the last months, after and considering the electoral crisis in post-elections processes, they found themselves to be in some sort of a frozen state. And then several members of the Alliance of Patriots, they decided to go and become members of the MP, so they left this party, and so we don't know yet how this party will participate in the political processes inside the parliament or outside, etc. And the same can be said about Vasadze's party. It is really very new addition to the political spectrum because now he's representing the already officially registered, so to say, movement. And so we'll see what role he will play and his movement and whether his ambitions will be successful to somehow consolidate the far right's wing. So I think it's too early yet to speak about it. As to the second question, which was about the social issues and secondary nature or economic issues, etc., and what could be the reasons. First of all, one thing that is pertinent to these groups in Georgia and beyond it is that they focus on problems, but not solutions, rather. And it is quite understandable too, because, you know, mentioning problems, you know, formulation of problems is much easier than finding solutions to these problems. So it can be quite normal. And this doesn't explain, of course, why they focus on socio-cultural and not socio-economic issues. And one explanation may be that when we see this, you know, the locals versus foreigners, etc., when this when the foreigners are sexually have body, and if we can see them then physically, so to say, when they have the physical shape, then of course this contradiction can be, you know, more physically viewed. So when we speak about unemployment, it doesn't have the physical body, right? And it's an abstract topic, unlike LGBT groups, which are the physical people, right? And therefore it's easier to attack them and, you know, to promote your influences and powers, especially in such a conservative country like Georgia. Another thing that I want to add is that they have another trend to focus less on facts and the evidence, but rather emotions. And when we talk about socio-cultural and some fears, of course, it's easier to talk about such topics when you want to promote emotions and fear than such specific issues like unemployment or poverty, etc. And therefore, this, you know, socio-cultural issues is not only a problem of populist actors in Georgia, but I think it's all over. I think that this was it. Oh, sorry, there was the third question about the church. As to the church, it's hard to speak directly what are the causal links. So who makes who stronger, the church, far right, or vice versa. However, the positions are very similar, even coinciding very often. And if one group would go and have the action of protesting against the government and would require something, then the far rights would have the counteraction of protest, and they would, you know, be sort of, you know, a blessing of the church, and they would, you know, sort of, and the churches would somehow validate those groups, and they are very often violent against others. And the church was always post factum making statements that, you know, they are against violence, etc. But prior to that, they would say that it is natural, you know, because people are so angry and therefore they become aggressive and they would, you know, resort to violence, etc. Yeah, so they would speak about non-supporting violence only post factum, so to say. So this is what I could say briefly, not to take much of our time.
Thank you very much. Still, everybody can raise his or her hand for the second round. I just want to remind this. It's not a blue button, but it's written also raise hands. And maybe Anna, you are the next.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for the questions. I think an image of good Europe is generally associated for Ukrainian far right with But those actors in Europe that do not support Russian foreign policy. And of course, these potential partners or partners of Ukrainian far right in Europe do not necessarily adhere to the liberal agenda. So again, we talk about the same values in terms of LGBT and other vulnerable communities. Before 2014, there were some cooperation examples between Ukrainian national populist parties and Western parties, for instance, the French National Front, which cooperated with the Freedom Party, Ukrainian Freedom Party. However, when the war started, some of these partners justified Russia's actions in Ukraine, so they immediately ceased to be partners of Ukrainian far right. On the other hand, there are still some networking and some cooperation. One of the most active actors within this field is the National Corps, Ukrainian organization that is represented through different levels, ranging from the party to the regiment. So this influential actor builds contacts across the Europe and hosts even the conferences on foreign policy issues as well. For instance, the cooperation of Ukraine or potential cooperation of Ukraine with the Baltic and Black Sea countries. As far as the recommendations are concerned, I think that the key recommendation for Ukrainian authorities to tackle this challenge of national populism, both Ukrainian and Russian, would be to pursue a genuine and sustainable judiciary reform. Basically, that's one of the demands the Ukrainian authorities repeatedly hear from European partners, from the partners from the US, from all development partners that support the country. So if people do not trust to law enforcement, that they may tolerate further attacks committed against vulnerable groups. And if these actors demonstrate, if the law enforcement demonstrates that it is impotent and it cannot address its tasks and it cannot protect people, then Ukrainians will increasingly believe that these problems may be addressed by quick and fixed solutions suggested by national populists. Another recommendation would be to build capacity in terms of media literacy, especially for those people who reside in east of Ukraine, in particular in frontline communities, to teach them how to consume and whether to consume Russian media product. I think one more recommendation would be to protect the rights of those people who are usually targeted by national populists. And there are some positive steps taken by Ukrainian authorities. For instance, Kyiv administration usually during last years, they are usually quite friendly towards LGBT rights, and they task the police to raise security and to protect people who join these events. And this is something that is quite positive and is increasing in its scale. And we hope that the local authorities in other cities, not only in the capital, will support these strategies of protection increasingly. And the last question was on church. And I think that if we compare with Georgia, in Ukraine, the church is not that influential probably. And still it can affect some policies. For instance, I think it's one of the most speaking examples. Ukraine signed the Istanbul Convention against gender violence, but cannot ratify it because the main opponent of this step is the Council of Churches of Ukraine. And the main reason behind the opposition to this step is that they don't like the concept of gender, which that is proposed in the convention. And many actors try to advocate for positive decision, but at this moment, this pathway is totally blocked by this religious union.
Thank you. Denis, please.
I think that Anna covered many aspects, but I would like to add to what she mentioned, that the European Union is, as I referred to, is a sort of mitigator, can play the role of mitigating factor against the opposition, against the populist parties that in the case of Moldova is in the opposition right now, by offering, by answering to the questions that sometimes are inconvenient for the populist politicians. So if they don't, they are unable to formulate solutions, then the EU is coming with those formulations. This is the interesting thing, that when they don't know how to fix an issue, then the EU can and is usually suggesting the solution. And this means some reforms that already imply some costs for them, political costs, obviously. So the EU is obviously an important player in this regard, but Moldova is not that important as, for instance, is Ukraine, in terms of networking between the Moldovan political parties that have populism as one of their tools, and the others in Europe. The most active political parties from Europe are the mainstream parties. They're active. They support usually those populist parties that are against corruption. And as I mentioned, this is one of the anti-elitist populist political forces, because they are against corrupt elite. And there is where we see some support. But again, we should be very careful how we are defining populism, because it can be seen both as something pejorative and positive. And I'm trying in the Moldovan part to look at both types of populism, because in my view, anti-corruption movements, though it's anti-elitist, it's not a negative type of populism. And now, with regard to the church, I think that in Moldova, the church is very popular. It has the highest level of public support. It's about 70–80%, the most popular institution in the country, and therefore the discourse that is employed by the church counts. Now, I think that it happens quite frequently, like in the case of Georgia, where the church is coming post factum and trying to boost some populist discourses that were already risen. So it's not the initiator, and therefore it is a proxy actor. It's not a main actor, which is the driver of populism, but rather the one which is trying to benefit from what already was thrown at the public by the mainstream, or let's say marginal populist political parties.
Thank you. I don't see a hand at the moment for the second round. Do we have one more questions? I don't know if maybe we read, Nino, you read it out.
Yes, okay, we have a couple of questions actually. Let me start from the English question, and we have also some questions as well. From anonymous attendee, we have such kind of question, probably to all the speakers. One could observe that concerning the recent electoral electoral results and their minor political presence, the ultranationalist parties in associated countries seem much weaker compared to similar parties in the core of EU, the Vox Spain, AfD in Germany, National Rally in France, etc. Therefore, which are the main aspects that make them a danger for European integration, since in the EU itself, these narratives are more cemented. This is a question. I would like to also read out one English comment from the chat, which says that it's good to notice that a new force of Levan Vasadze from the Georgian Party Politics supports opponents of constructing of hydropower plant Namakhvani, so it is kind of changing the attitude of national populists. I mean, they also try to focus on economic issues, not only social, cultural ones. This is just a comment. If Tamta or others wish to respond on it, floor is yours. And lastly, let me read out one Georgian question.
Salome Kandelaki asks, if you ask Romanians, they would say that this Russian narrative is coming from so-called Moldavia and through Russia. So, what do you think is the role of the Orthodox Church in identifying the Moldovan or Romanian identity, or with regard to these issues? Now, I will start answering. It's about Vasadze and his involvement in this protest against Namakhvani hydropower station. I think that his and other far right's involvement is not the sign of them deciding to speak about economic issues, but they see these economic issues from the point of view of identity. Because if you ask them, they'll tell you that they participate in this protest because it's a Turkish company who is the biggest shareholder in this project of the hydropower station, hydropower plant. And it's not the economic issues that they put up front, but rather, again, the foreigners, the Turkish company. As to risks and threats to Euro integration, as we wrote in our policy paper, the nationalist populist actors, they are sort of tied or restricted in terms of their discourse with regard to EU, and this is why the majority agrees this one of the foreign focuses and the policy focuses for Georgia is Euro and Euro-Atlantic integration. This is why they refrain from speaking much about it. So they are expressing the sort of soft Euroscepticism, so they do not directly say that we're against Euro integration, but they would against some certain political reforms and steps which would these Euro integration imply, like for instance the anti-discrimination law, that they were against a lot. Therefore, they wouldn't say out loud that Georgia should reject its Euro-Atlantic future. But again, as I said, it would be, long-term, step-by-step, shifting and changing public opinions and shifting towards far right.
Thank you, Tamta. Just one question to you. Do you have any additional recommendation? Because the other two had the opportunity to give some recommendations. Is there something you would add? Also, the last round, and you have the last words, all of you. Yeah, just to make.
Well, I think that Anna and Denis, they mentioned very important things that would help in, somehow, if not combating them, just mitigating those groups and, making more silent. The point remains that we don't know these groups very well because very little time and effort is allocated to really studying what and who they are. And, the government's approach is that they would pay attention to some of their ideas, they would support or not support, but they somehow neglect those groups as such. And I think that should change. Georgian Institute of Politics is quite actively involved in it and supports lots of different studies and research. But I think that we really need to support more academic, in-depth research and study of those groups. Because to combat them, we need to know them very well. So studying them well would be a very important step in this regard.
Thank you. Denis?
Thank you. I can only support what Tamta just mentioned. I think that we need to depoliticize the examination of the populist parties, and studying them through an academic perspective will be exactly what it is necessary to avoid the white noise around this issue and really focus on who they are, to profile them and to understand the origins of their appearance, how they actually, where they get their origins and who are their supporters, so that we can really in a sustainable way address these issues. And quickly to answer to the question related to the Romanian identity in Moldova, I think that Moldova is going through a process of modernization, which also implies the reconsidering of many values that are underlying for the Moldovan society. And I think that the European integration is somehow the solution for many issues which were neglected for many decades. And therefore, integration into the EU is a perfect blend with reconnecting with the Romanian civilizational space, because Romania is already in the EU, and that is why partly I think we have escaped Moldova from having this nationalist populism around the Romanian identity, and this is something positive because we can talk about Romanian identity through a constructive perspective, and understanding that Moldova can benefit if we agree with this part of our history. Moldovans speak Romanian, which is an official language of the EU. Moldovans have Romanian identity, which makes it automatically European citizens, which is not the case for Georgia or Ukraine, who should actually fight for a place under the umbrella of European nations. Moldovans are somehow benefited because of Romanian identity. And the church, in general, the church is has played for many years and for a long time placed a divisive role in the society, unfortunately. And this also was visible during the pandemic, by the way, because the church was one of those voices which confused the population with regard to the safety measures and contradicted the state and even the international organizations when it comes to how to face the pandemic, a critical moment, and how to actually be part of the crisis management that the state tried to create together with the international community. So why I'm saying international community, because this brings me back to what I have mentioned during the presentation. There is a growing interest from some populist political forces to portray the foreign actors as a destructive and distracting force from what is really important for Moldovans. And these political forces are represented by the pro-Russian political parties. So we need to take care about the role of the church, and to rather speak to the church. And we have in one of our recommendations something related exactly to this cooperation that we need to ensure between the secular state institutions and the church.
Okay. Thank you. Anna? Something to add?
Yeah, but just I would like to address the question on the impact for Euro integration perspectives. I don't think again that currently the cohort of Ukrainian national populists may pose any serious threat to this path of Ukraine, to this foreign policy agenda. Also because this is a part of Ukrainian constitution, and this is sort of a consensus in Ukrainian society, and that Ukraine should have these aspirations for Euro integration. Anytime Ukrainian authorities do receive some signals from the European partners, it's rather about the flawed rule of law. So, however, the development of Russian nationalism in now occupied territories does have some implications and can be a threat because once or if the territories are deoccupied, Ukrainian authorities will have to deal with a certain mindset, which is not necessarily open to the questions of Euro integration. Yes, you probably know that Russia is imposing the view that Ukraine doesn't need any unions and should keep a neutral status. The same narrative is advanced also in government-controlled areas of Ukraine. And this can also have some implications because this, as already mentioned, this is around 20% of Ukrainian population that that can vote for pro-Russian politicians. So these 20% are also quite susceptible to believe that Ukraine doesn't need any unions and may be independent or neutral in terms of foreign policy. So I think that's it from my side.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the three speakers. I enjoyed this discussion very much, and I would like to hand over for the final word to Renata from GIP.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, all the speakers. My one takeaway from this discussion is that, well, right, populism indeed is not unique to Georgia or to Eastern Partnership, though sometimes it has been treated as such. We tend to approach the problems and challenges in each of the Eastern Partnership countries as if they're happening for the first time. So this joint discussion and a little bit broader putting into context the issues such as populism is really appreciated. What is special for the Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine is that these are societies going through major transformation right now. In part, it is connected to the integration to the European Union, just like Denis mentioned as well. And hopefully it will lead us to stronger democracy, better, stronger societies. But it also carries with it uncertainty and fear that feeds populist groups and the challenges that comes with it. Thank you to the speakers for shedding more light on the trends of nationalist populism in Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova. Thank you to all those who attended the event, who participated in the discussion, raised questions, and listened to it. We look forward to connecting with you soon. Just as I mentioned at the beginning, we will be sharing the policy paper on today's topic shortly. And also we look forward to seeing you in our future events, online or live. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.